Okay, we will now go to item 10. And just to recap on item 10, this is addressing the change on policy 3D of the National Policy Statement. We had a workshop on this in the month of February, and for that workshop we also had in attendance, other than the members of this committee, we had chairs of local boards or their appointees, and this is primarily about an amendment that government has made of policy D. So it's an amendment to the National Policy Statement of August 2020. I'm getting my dates right. What's not on the agenda is a lot of decisions that we'll be making around the NPSUD coming at the end of this month on the 31st of March. So we'll be looking at the qualifying matter of special character then, not now. And we'll also be looking at the residential intensification provisions of the NPSUD then, not now. So we are looking at some planning decisions around just 3D at the moment. So a lot more to go on this, members, particularly on the 31st of March, when we will be looking at the NPSUD, our response to that in a lot more detail. So today we're being asked to rescind our Planning Committee resolution of, I think it was last year, in 21, and that's around 3D. It's a requirement because the Parliament or the government has required us to do this. It's not an option. And the other decisions are outlined there on your paper. So today we have John Dugood, our GM of Plans and Places, with us, who will introduce. Chan Lu is a policy planner in John's unit as well, and Ryan Bradley, a senior policy planner who has authored this report. I will now hand to John. Before I do so, I'm going to move the motions that are the recommendations in the report, and I'll put those forward. Do I have a second, please? Deputy Chair, are you willing to second the recommendations before us?
Sorry, Chair, maybe someone else, just in case I end up voting against it. Thank you.
Okay, can I have a second, please?
I'll second.
Councillor Dalton, thank you. Right, I'm going to hand to John now. John Dugood, GM Plans and Places.
Kia ora tātou. Thank you, Chair. Look, I think with your introduction, I'll really just hand directly over to Ryan Bradley, our senior planner, who's going to take you through a short presentation similar to the one in your workshop the other day. So I'll just hand off to Ryan. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So the presentation I've got, I'm just not sure, do I share it from my screen or is it on your screen there already? I think it might just be easier if I just share it.
Ryan, you share it from yours, please.
Okay, sure. Okay, is that coming up on your screen now?
That's perfect, thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so as explained, I'm here to tell you about one of the changes to the National Policy Statement on Urban Development that came through the RMA Amendment Act just before Christmas last year, and that's around Policy 3D. Now, Policy 3 in itself covers the intensification policies. So these are the policies that direct councils to increase heights and densities in various areas. So policies 3A, B and C cover intensification in and around the city centre, the metropolitan centres and around major public transport stations. And there are no changes to those policies, but 3D, policy 3D has been completely changed. And so I'll explain the change for you now. So the formal wording of policy 3D was basically directing the council to intensify all other areas, and it was to be based on levels of accessibility and demand. And now that policy has been completely removed and changed with this new one here, which is more specific, and it's asking for intensification to be located within and adjacent to neighbourhood, local and town centres. And the building heights and densities are to be commensurate with the level of commercial activity and community services in that centre. So basically, the higher the level of activities and services in the centre, the more intensification is expected to occur. And this new policy no longer refers to the all other areas that the former policy did. And that's essentially now because that is covered by the new medium density residential standards, which is you would have heard of the new thing in the Act that allows for 3 houses up to 3 stories across nearly all residential sites in the urban area. So last year, the Planning Committee resolved on how to apply the former Policy 3D, and now that is redundant. So this agenda item is outlining for you the approach we've taken to applying the new Policy 3D into the unitary plan. And due to the very short time frame we've adopted a fairly simple method. And I should also note here that what I'm outlining is only half the story. So I'm going to talk you through where the National Policy Statement directs intensification to go. However, I've not covered in this agenda item the issue of qualifying matters. And qualifying matters, just as a quick reminder, are reasons why there might be proposed increase in height and density might be removed or adjusted down. And a qualifying matter can be a thing like a significant natural area, volcanic view shaft, special character areas, nationally significant infrastructure, and so on. So the qualifying matters and how they impact on the proposed intensification directed by Policy 3 is a separate issue outside of this agenda item. So this agenda item only looks at how we should apply Policy 3D to Auckland, ignoring qualifying matters for now, but obviously they will come into play later on. So the method we've used in determining how to apply Policy 3D to the unitary plan in Auckland is firstly looking at determining the level of commercial activities and community services in each centre. And then for the centres with the higher levels of activities and services, we will look to apply new, more intensive zonings. So to determine the level of commercial activities and community services in each centre, we looked at 3 variables. The first variable is the centre's role in the unitary plan's hierarchy of centre zones. So here we've got at the very bottom of the hierarchy, the neighbourhood centre zone. So these are generally just a small collection of shops. It's usually corner shops. It'd be perhaps a dairy, a takeaways, bakery, chemist, and so on. And often they can just be a standalone shop by itself, so one dairy or one service station. And there are around 400 different neighbourhood centre zones across Auckland, and the average size is around 3,000 square metres, so they're fairly small. The next step up in the hierarchy are the local centres, and these centres provide local convenience needs for the surrounding residential areas. They typically include some local retail, commercial services, offices, restaurants, takeaways, and sometimes a smaller supermarket. There are 74 local centres across Auckland, with the average size being around 3 hectares. Some examples of local centres in Auckland are places like Goff Harbour, Beach Haven, Dawson's Road, Massey Road, and Waiuku. The next step up in the hierarchy are the town centres. So these are larger centres, usually located on arterial roads with good public transport. They have a wide range of activities, including commercial, leisure, residential, community and civic services as well. There are 44 town centres in Auckland. Average size is around 10 hectares. And some examples of town centres in Auckland are places like Helensville, Whangaparoa, Point Chevalier, Ponsonby, Stoddard Road, Mangere, Manurewa and Pukekohe. So based on this hierarchy of centres, it's my view that the neighbourhood centres do not have a level of commercial activities and community services that is commensurate with any additional intensification beyond the current unitary plan zonings, and noting that the medium density residential standards will apply as a default around these neighbourhood centres anyway, meaning that you'll get 3 dwellings of 3 stories as a permitted activity, essentially. So certainly no further intensification beyond this is warranted, in my view, around neighbourhood centres. In terms of local centres and town centres, though, they may warrant further intensification, and we're going to base this on two further variables. The first is the size of the centre. So the idea being that the larger the centre, the higher the level of activities and services there will be. So there's a large range of size in the centres. The average local centre is around 3 hectares, but they can be as small as 2,500 square metres and as large as 18 hectares. And the average town centre is 10 hectares. They can be as small as 2 hectares and as large as 25 hectares. So not all centres are equal. And therefore, all local and town centres have been classified as either small or large, depending on where they lie against the average, and under the average being small and above the average being large. The second variable we looked at was accessibility of the centre or its catchment. The idea being that the larger the catchment, the higher the level of activities and services there will be. The centre catchments of both population and jobs were calculated using a 45-minute public transport trip. And centres with an accessibility score below the average were classified as having low accessibility, while those above the average were classified as having high accessibility. So based on this research, we came up with the following principles on how to apply the new policy 3D within and adjacent to the various centres. So the first principle we've come up with is that there is no change within the centre zone. So that's within the neighbourhood, local and town centre zones themselves. And that's because they already have a very generous amount of height and density standards in those centres, which we think is commensurate with the level of commercial activities and community services that those centres have. Second principle is that there is no intensification under policy 3D adjacent to, so we're talking about the land around the centres, not the centre zone themselves, but the residential land around these centres. We're talking about no intensification under this policy for any neighbourhood centre. As I talked about before, we don't think they have the level of services and activities commensurate with any further upzoning. Local centres in our classification that come out as small and or low accessibility, and any town centre with low accessibility. But bearing in mind with all of this, I'll say again, the medium density residential standards still apply. So when I say there's no intensification, there's no policy 3D intensification, but there still will be the medium density residential standards applying to these areas, these residential areas around the centres. So the next principle is that we will apply the terraced housing and apartment building zone for all residential sites around 200 metres from local centres that are large and have high accessibility, and town centres that are small and have high accessibility. And then finally, we'll apply the terraced housing and apartment building zone for residential sites around 400 metres from town centres that are both large and have high accessibility. So the outcome of these rezoning principles are that we see in the north and the south, so the rural areas in the north and the south, and also in the outer islands, there is no intensification under policy 3D. So none of the centres in the smaller towns or out in the islands have any intensification in or around them under these principles. What we do have though is 11 centres in the north and west. These are local and town centres, would have terraced housing and apartment building zone applied to them. Some already have some of this zone around them, so it would be expanding that zone, and some of them have none of it around them, so it would be completely new. There are also 11 centres in the south and east that receive additional terraced housing and apartment building zoning, and 22 centres in the Auckland Isthmus that would receive the terraced housing and apartment building zoning around those local and town centres. So that basically summarises the approach that we are taking for the new policy 3D, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ryan. Happy to take questions now, members. I will just check on the conversation bar. I don't have any questions in front of me at the moment? Ryan, okay, look, a question I posed last evening, I'm not sure whether it's come to you via John. Just in terms of the scoring, we've basically got, in terms of accessibility, there's either low or high. There's no median. Can you just take us through how you've arrived at, such really, there's just a clear boundary between low and high. There's sort of nothing in between. Can you take us through that? Because I found that a little bit strange. And also, some of the centres are identified, like Wellsford is obviously with low accessibility, but it's 8.8 hectares, but it's identified as small in size. And then you go to Albany Village, which is 8.4, and that's considered large. Can you just explain some of those numbers?
So in terms of the last question, I think that is because the Wellsford Centre is a town centre. Average size of town centre is about 10 hectares, so it's below the average. Whereas that Albany Village is a local centre, so those are generally smaller. So 8 hectares is actually larger than the average for the local centres. But in terms of the first question around why we've just classified them as high and low and we don't have a medium, that's a fair question, and it's something we could have done. It would be easy enough to do, but we were trying to keep this exercise quite simple and high level, noting that we only got told about this new policy basically on the 20th of December, so we had to act fast on it. Probably the main reason we didn't create a medium category is it just really would have complicated the process, and the benefits I don't think are really clear, because where we have a large and small or high and a low classification, that leads directly to a zoning response. So taking it back a step, our walkable catchments under the policy 3C have 800 metre walking catchments. What we've done for the large and accessible town centres have a 400 metre radius around them, or a 5-minute walk. And then for the town centres that are the small or the large local centres, we've got the 200 metre radius, which is 200 metre radius around a 2.5 minute walk. So if we created another medium distance in between that, we'd have to have some sort of other 300 metres or a 3-minute walk or something like that. And it starts to get quite overly complicated, and I think unnecessary, and probably quite hard to justify why we're working in 30-second intervals and so on. So I think using the 800, 400 and 200 was just a simpler approach to go to and easier to justify than getting right down into tiny increments.
Okay, so look, I hear that. So if we had more time, I understand our unit has been under a lot of pressure. It's had to redo work. It had work in response to the original MPSUD underway. A lot of that work became redundant, and you had to reset yourselves after the legislation was passed. So if we had more time, would we have taken a more nuanced approach to heights and density around the town and local centres with high accessibility, the ones with high accessibility, taking into account that local context and the zoning of the adjacent residential, which would of course be medium density as required by the legislation. So if we had more time, would we have taken a more nuanced approach? Would this look different?
I don't think we would have taken a more nuanced approach in terms of 400 metres, 200 metres. I think that's already a very nuanced approach. We're getting very small distances there in terms of town planning and walkable catchments and so on. I think if we had more time, I would have liked to have done more work on determining the level of community services and activities in each centre. So what we've done is we've based it very simply on the size of the centre, so the footprint of how much zone is in there. But there are things, we looked at it and said that the zoning is basically the best thing to use because there's a lot of churn. You can't just look at what the activities are out there at the moment. Restaurants and shops and stuff could be open this year, closed next year. But I think if we had more time, it would be good to try to have looked at more of the activities that are more permanent. So like say supermarkets generally don't flip and change every year, that they're more long-term things. Civic facilities like libraries and swimming pools and parks and so on, those things don't generally change. So if we had more time, I would have liked to include those in our analysis to try to figure out which sites would be more deserving of more intensification because they had more community services and more commercial activities. But having said that, I'm not sure if I'd done the exercise whether it would come up with much different to what I've done now, to be honest. I think there might be some slight nuances, but I think it would probably come up with something very similar.
Okay, look, I'll go to others for questions here, but if I could just leave you with this, that identifying community services is fundamental to understanding how we'd implement 3D. I mean, it's clearly worded there in the new 3D. But look, I can understand the difficulty of lack of time. We're really under the pump on this one. I will go to questions, and I think the first, I'll have to go back. Sandra, can you help me with the first question, please?
Yes, Councillor Walker, please.
Okay, Councillor Walker, first question.
Sure. So I've got a few questions. And
can I give you, I've got a lot of people wanting to ask questions, so can we take 2 questions? And
are we on some kind of time constraint for what is a very important issue?
I'll take 2 questions,
be rather
and then I'll come back. No, I'll take 2 questions, and then I'll come back after others have had the opportunity to ask 2 questions as well. Thanks, Councillor.
Okay. So I've got a question around how this applies in practice and the relevance of what the government is imposing versus the unitary plan. So if I take a specific example, which is Whangaparāoa Town Centre, which is a town centre that I'm very familiar with, it's on a ridge, a very high point in the landscape, so there are significant aesthetic effects. On one side, the land falls away steeply, very steeply, down into a catchment called Arkles, which is totally unsuited to any intensity of development. On the opposite side of the road, a very busy road, which is the only road that carries traffic down much of this part of the peninsula, it's highly undesirable to have intensive development because of transport effects, particularly side friction and so on. Now, I could elaborate on a range of matters that will make the type of development that is proposed literally disastrous in terms of aesthetics, in terms of traffic, in terms of livability and the like. Is there any way that any of these matters can be considered as qualifying? So that's a question.
Okay, Ryan, can I go to you, and can you draw our attention to Whangaparāoa on page 82?
So first of all, in the appendix of my report, it does classify all the centres as to whether they are small or large or have high or low accessibility. And you see that Whangaparāoa is not one of the places that is going to, under this proposal, would have any further intensification around it under policy 3D. So I'm not sure if that negates the rest of the question, but in terms of the other issues you raise around the steepness of land and so on around it, those things could come in as qualifying matters, I believe, like in terms of, which I'm not completely, maybe John could jump in here with the qualifying matters, but I think things like coastal erosion and is land stability, is that in there as a qualifying matter? I'm not 100% sure actually.
Well, just jump in. Natural hazards, be it coastal hazards or other significant natural hazards, are already agreed to by the committee as a qualifying matter, and there's strong support for that in the NPSUD and the Amendment Act. More localised landscape issues of the sort, Councillor Walker, you're referring to, we haven't yet as a council endorsed those as a qualifying matter. There will be a lot of work and evidence required to justify why around a particular town centre there is a local landscape visual aesthetic reason why some additional form of intensification shouldn't go ahead. but certainly outstanding landscapes that are mapped in the unitary plan, they are already a given, that we will be avoiding compromising those. The view shafts, as we've talked about, the height sensitive areas around the maunga. So there are some landscape elements that could be a good justification, but to start getting into very local aesthetic issues, I think that's I think I have to be upfront that to do that by August robustly will be a real challenge. But for Whangaparaoa, as you've heard, the recommendation at this point is that it isn't subject to any additional intensification under this policy 3D.
And that is because in part of accessibility. How does that accessibility change, for example, when we have Penlink, for example, when other things change, when we might happen to have a more regular bus service? How quickly does that change?
Good question. The way we're based is on a public transport service. So if there's public transport going down Penlink, that could make a difference. But it all depends on when we would review this in the future. And I don't think, I think we're talking about years away for looking at that sort of thing. And again, it's comparing its accessibility to other town centres. So if it's still not as accessible as other town centres, then it's still not going to be in the high category.
Okay, the other question I've got just
Final
goes
question, thanks.
To the overall context of these reforms, which as I understand it are around bringing more houses. What is the difference between what is proposed here as it goes to 3D and what we already have under the unitary plan? I mean, is this adding much, or is it just adding potential problems if we assume that the unitary plan was reasonably well considered?
John, I might go to you on that one. Is it best there, John?
Yeah, I think Ryan can certainly add something as well, but the starting point is that this is a mandatory element of the NPSUD, the Amendment Act, and now embodied in the NPSUD. So we are absolutely required to look at a gradation of intensification around centres based on the level of community services and other services that they offer. So it's a mandatory part. Yes, the unitary plan has a similar approach. This was part of the Amendment Act that we in general supported because it does align quite well with the unitary plan. But the unitary plan is not particularly consistent on this issue. So these smaller centres, not the metros, but around the town and local centres, there is a huge degree of a fairly high degree of variation, and some of that is quite difficult to track and explain exactly how that happens. So we do have some town centres that are highly accessible that don't have any terraced housing apartment zoning around them. It's just one of the consequences of the process that went through. So this would achieve a greater degree of consistency across the region than we currently have in the unitary plan. But Ryan, you've got a general sense of over the region, how big a change is this? It's probably back to you. What's your sense of the degree of change across the region?
Yeah, there is quite a degree of change. That there are centres, I guess, cutting to the chase, and we're not showing you the maps today, but spoiler alert, if you go to the appendix, you can see in the last page says town centres large size and high accessibility, and it's got a list there. Those are the ones that get 400 metres around them. And then if you look back up, the next list is the ones that get 200 metres around them. So if you looking at the last page where it starts with Avondale, Birkenhead, Browns Bay, those are the ones that we're suggesting get 400 metres. So Browns Bay already has quite a lot of high intensity around it. So it's getting a little bit added, but somewhere like Birkenhead didn't have that much. So it does have quite a significant change. So across the region, basically what John was saying, it does even things out where there used to be quite a lot of regional differences. Now it's getting a lot more consistent. But I would say that in this policy 3D intensification, overall is very small fry compared to what's happening under policy 3A, B and C, where we've got the walk-up catchments. Those areas are much bigger than what we're talking about here. and also the medium density residential standards that applies to pretty much the whole of the residential area of Auckland. Those things are much larger in terms of intensification than what has been proposed here.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Walker. I'll go to Councillor Clune, please.
Tēnā koe, Chair, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou. Kia ora, Ryan, thank you for your presentation. I would just like to ask my partai, directed at the sort of starting point for the recommendation, and in paragraph 26 and other paragraphs, it talks about the potential activities in each centre can be determined by looking at the current unitary plan zoning. And I just wonder, in terms of your recommendation that we don't relook at that zoning, is that missing a trick there in terms of the need for further work to assess whether the current zoning is actually adequate? And I ask that question when you think about centres, ones that I know that I'm familiar with, say Greylin, Kingsland, that are likely to have a lot more transport orientated development, even though they haven't been defined as being on the rapid transport network. So, or Kingsland might have, but so have we kind of got the starting point right in terms of what is going to happen the potential of those centres, and also what has changed in the last 6 years since the unitary plan?
So we have not looked at, we've not re-examined all the centres. We've basically used what is there at the moment. We've not gone and said, is Kingsland, I'm not actually sure off the top of my head if Kingsland is a town or a local centre, but we haven't gone and reassessed the hierarchy of every centre and said, is it in the right role? We've had to assume with the time we have that they are, at this point in time, the correct spot in the hierarchy. And then when I'm talking about potential in paragraph 26, that was more referring to the fact that the zone enables a whole wide range of things. And in some centres, there might be very little happening. In other centres, there might be a lot happening. If they've got the same zone, they've actually got the potential to have exactly the same amount of things happening. And so we didn't want to just look at, say, measuring floor space and say, right, which centres have got the most floor space at the moment? Those are the ones that have got the most commercial activities. Therefore, we're going to intensify around them, when a centre down the road could have just as much potential for those activities. So that's what I was meaning by potential. It was more the potential that the zoning enables for so many activities, restaurants, supermarkets and all that sort of thing most of them are permitted activities in the town centre zone, so they could basically turn up tomorrow. And so that's what we were trying to take account of in that paragraph. But we weren't looking at re-evaluating all the centres' role in the hierarchy as part of this process.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, if I just clarify, so Ryan, your recommendation B1 is essentially saying that we're not revisiting the current unitary plan zoning within the centres, but the supplementary question I have to that, if that's the case, is this process going to allow that in terms of the consultation and the feedback that we might get?
The recommendation B1 is around saying we don't think we need to change the building heights or densities within the centre zones themselves. And though it's got a thing around subject to review of the height variation control, which we need to do, which applies to some centres. But that's not so much around, again, reviewing the hierarchy and saying whether each centre is in the correct hierarchy. And from my point of view, I don't think there is really scope under this plan change to be doing that. But John might want to comment on that.
John.
I sort of check with our legal team, but I suspect people could submit, come August, put a submission in to say that we haven't increased the heights enough in particular town centres, or that we haven't got an extensive enough amount of terrace and apartment zoning around them. So, my feeling is that probably is within scope of submissions, but we need to check with our legal team and come back to you on that sort of issue come 31st of March. But yeah, others could argue it, but I think the key point here is that you know, we've only got so much time through to August. We did a huge amount of work on town centres, local centres through the AUP process. There is a hierarchy of heights and categorisation between town and local centre. So you know, it's probably something that we just simply don't have the time to do. There are other more significant things to address under the NPSUD than revisit the hierarchy of the centres and the heights within centres. But others probably can make submissions on that point and give us feedback on that point in April.
Thank you for that. And I think it's not just within the zone, it's also whether the zone is covers the right area as well, which
Correct.
is potentially not excluded. So,
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I'm just trying to work out who's next on the questions here. Look, I'll just go to the Deputy Chair, actually. Sandra, could you just prompt me with the order of the questions, please?
Sure, it's Deputy Mayor Cashmore next.
It's the Deputy Mayor next. Deputy Mayor Cashmore, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Ryan. Good to see you, and John. My question is about the totality of these enabling plan changes, this one, and about these local centres and town centres for population potential growth that helps direct our finances as far as transport networks and investment is concerned. Do we have that sort of what would be the whole potential population increases enabled by these plan changes?
Ryan, I can take that one. So it's Councillor Cashmore. It's very much work in progress. We will be doing that analysis once we have a base draft plan ready, sort of for public release. Some aspects of it in April. So we will do that analysis of what extra capacity is created, what that all means. We'll be looking at the economic viability of this extra capacity. It won't be creating more population growth in Auckland, but it will be shifting potentially where some of the housing occurs. So that will be part of the analysis. We're just not quite there yet.
Yeah, that's what I was meaning, John. Thank you for that. So, okay, we'll see that work when it comes. We'll change the financial focus of where investment goes, probably, to a degree. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor.
Councillor Fletcher.
Councillor Fletcher. Thank you, Councillor Fletcher. Your call.
Thank you. And may I thank Ryan for the clarity in which he is trying to give us this information. We all feel, I suppose, at times like, mice on the treadmill trying to keep up with the legislation. However, I'm still needing to be quite clear today what we decide today, whether you need that information to inform the information you're going to bring to us on the 31st of March, but can any decisions taken today, which are in the absence, as you pointed out before, of qualifying matters and all sorts of other things, can this be revisited, or this sets in stone this stage as we see you work progressively through with the ridiculous time restraints? So I'm just a little unclear as to what the process is as we work our way through this.
So I would just say that, yes, we do need you to sign off on some policy or some direction for policy 3D today, so that on the 31st we can give you a full set of what the whole intensification is going to look like across Auckland. But then in terms of if you then change your mind on that, I guess, John, I'm not sure where on the 31st, what the scope is for pulling back on some of those things.
Councillor Fletcher and members of the committee, I guess it is very much putting the pegs in place and sort of moving in a direction, but this is all still in the draft phase. So this is gearing up for a draft that we will release as much as we possibly can in April. But it's not till August that you have to make final decisions, and so really it's putting things in place so that we have a reasonable draft response to as many aspects of the NPSUD and the Amendment Act as we can Aucklanders to give us feedback on the key areas where we have some discretion, because there are many areas where we simply don't have any discretion at all as council. But absolutely, as the feedback comes in and as you become familiar with what that feedback is saying, as council, the August plan change could take a different approach. But this is the sort of officer advice at this stage, going into a draft process in April and then back again for August.
I really appreciate that response, Mr. Chair, because for members of the public who are following this, I still see things as being very fluid, and this isn't setting in concrete matters today, but it's giving the support to our officers to keep progressing work, and that's sort of my understanding of where things are. Am I correct, Mr. Chairman?
Well, I think you've identified it correctly, Councillor Fletcher. While it is fluid, we are taking steps as well, but we're still in the early stages of quite a long process, which includes, as best we can, the opportunity for the public to have a look at it prior to the public consultation, but that has been narrowed down due to the restriction in time that we have now. But you are correct, it's a fluid process, but we are taking steps towards something that the council sees fit to notify in August. And then it goes into that process of hearing and very likely further changes once evidence has come in. So, Councillor Fletcher, I hope...
Thank you. That's very helpful, and I won't take speaking time, but I really do want to commend John and Ryan for trying to bring as much clarity to this as possible. They've been really outstanding today. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Fletcher. I think you and I know, and another number of councillors know, the overtime that our people have been putting in on this to meet these deadlines. Thank you, Councillor Fletcher. I will now go to Councillor Watson, I think it is. Councillor Watson, your call.
Yeah, just clarifying that process, and notwithstanding the use of the word fluidity, we are being asked today to endorse these principles for the application of the new policy, and there are changes there that go to a number of local centres and town centres, and I guess my question is, in light of that, the comment in point 9 that the detailed maps actually showing exactly where this happens in any given locality will be coming at a future time. So that in effect means that the vote of endorsement, or whatever it turns out to be today, is really being made in the absence of, and I understand the pressures that the officers are on, but from my perspective as elected person, that's really being made in the absence of it, of how it might affect any given town centre. So if I think of Browns Bay, we've got these general principles, but in terms of the streets and the extent of the actual residents that are affected, I'm going to have to wait for these detailed maps, aren't I?
Ryan, is that with you?
Yeah, essentially the detail we'll have to be waiting to see in the maps. But you do get an idea for it. So Browns Bay is in the town centre that has a 400 metre application of the terraced housing and apartment zone to it. So you can look at, there's already quite an extensive area of THAB zone and also mixed use zone around the Browns Bay town centre. So from memory, I don't think it isn't actually adding a huge amount to Browns Bay, but that has to be determined when you see the maps.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess that's my point, Ryan. And in some of these areas, just with the unitary plan, and it's become more evident during this term of council than the last. There are now, people discovering, one side of their street is zoned for THAB, the others, mixed housing, urban, or whatever it might happen to be. So it is quite a contentious issue in some parts of Auckland, more so than others. But just to be sure on the extent of the change again, so irrespective of how widespread it is, for the streets that are affected, essentially that they will be going from a zoning that translates from the current, which will be largely 3-storey, up to 5-storey. That's what we're talking about in on the ground effects, aren't we?
Yes, that's correct. So we're talking about when we apply the THAB around the 3D centres, we're talking about the 5-storey THAB. But I'd also just note, as well as just to remember in the background, that there's the medium density residential standards applying to the whole of Auckland. Yeah. So that we've got basically the baseline is 3 stories, 3 dwellings. So the THAB is the next step up from that. So the terrace housing and apartment zone is one of the most dense residential zones we have at the moment under the plan. Once we get the medium density residential standards in, it's actually not going to be too far from most of Auckland.
The medium density is 3 stories though, so this is yes. 2 stories above that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Thanks, Mr. Chair. I just think it's worth noting that point that that there is a bit of a gap here in terms of the specifics that from my perspective anyway, in some of these areas that have been very sensitive to even current unitary plan zonings, that it's not quite all that reassuring to be proceeding without a street by street awareness of actually who's captured in this, and I don't cast any aspersions on the officers who've been very busy getting it to this stage, but from an elected point of view, those maps are really quite important. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Watson, and we'll be seeing that in this month. That'll be the next step in the process. So thank you. Now I think I've got Councillor Cooper next. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. You might have explained it and I didn't get it, but looking at the small centres, both Sunnyvale and Swanson are similar size. One's got low accessibility, one's got high, but they're both near a train station. Is the difference about accessibility is it something to do with the Waitaku Ranges Heritage Protection Area, which puts in stone the amount of development available, that would make it not be able to have any development? And sort of beside that, would the Waitaku Ranges Protection Area, Heritage Protection Area, be a qualifying matter from changing to single house zone to the new zoning? Because we know we developed Penihana next door as a special structure plan to allow development next to the train station, but anywhere else, no. So except across the road. So, sorry, it's a bit of a convoluted thing, but they're quite similar little local centres, and they've both got trains, but they've got a different classification.
So was it Sunnyvale and Swanson? Is that right?
Oh no, sorry. Yeah, because Sunnyvale's in Henderson, and so they're and Swanson both on the Western train line.
Oh yeah. So I can't tell you exactly why, but I would think that Swanson is coming out as low. It's in the 32nd percentile. Sunnyvale's in the 57th percentile, coming out high. I guess it's probably just because Swanson's the last one on the track, isn't it? It's the end of the line.
Yeah,
and it's
has very intense development up behind on the foothills next to it already, but I just wondered if it's something to do with, because it's hard for me to kind of work out your scoring system. Sorry.
Right. No. So
I don't want to get into it.
Yes, it was nothing to do with the Waitaku Ranges or anything like that. All it was is how many people can get to that centre within 45 minutes using public transport.
Okay, so it's got a higher population. Yeah, because on the western side,
it's a bigger catchment than Swanson, because I guess it's at the end of the line. It takes longer to get to other places. But the other question you raised was, is the Waitaku Ranges Act a qualifying matter? And yes, it is a qualifying matter.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Cooper. Good question. Okay, we'll go to I think it's the Deputy Chair now. Councillor Bartley, please.
Oh, thank you, Chair, and thank you to the officers for the work in this report. I wanted to ask, because I really like the bit in the report where it talks about the potential of what could occur, but I don't feel that that is reflected in the principles. So, yeah, I guess my question is, what should the principles be if we took an approach that looked at the potential, that considered the potential of what could be?
So I think they do reflect the potential. So the other option we could have done was to not look at potential and look at what's actually happening on the ground. And so that way we would have measured floor space and said, right, instead of measuring the footprint of the centre, let's just figure out how many buildings there are, what's the floor space in each centre, and those centres will calculate the amount of commercial activity and civic amenities and so on based on that. That would have not taken into account potential. That would have just been what is going on today. So instead of doing that, we said, no, we're going to just look at the footprint of the zone, which does mean that there is potential, because some centres are currently underdeveloped, but tomorrow, who knows, someone could come in and build a supermarket or a apartment building, whatever it is. And so I think the principles we've used do include the potential of each centre, as opposed to just looking at what's there now. And basically classifying it as per 2022, what's going on at this current moment.
In what way? Because one of the principles says no change to building heights and density of urban form, which to me seems quite set, no change.
So are you talking about within the centres themselves, we're saying that the centre zones, so the neighbourhood centre zone allows up to 3 stories. The local centre zone has 4 stories height, and the town centre zone is variable, but can be between, say, I think 4 and 7 or 8 stories. And so what we're saying is that those are already quite generous, and so we don't see any need to increase the heights within the centres at this stage based on the level of activities in those centres, because they're already quite high. What we are looking at, instead of looking at the heights in the centres themselves, is we're looking at the areas around the centres, so the residential areas adjacent to the centres. Sometimes in some of these centres, there'll be, say, single house or mixed housing suburban around them, and we're suggesting, and where those centres are large or they have high access, that we should be intensifying around them with terraced housing and apartment building zones.
Okay, all right. And 3D is taking this wider than just like throughout Auckland, right?
So 3D looks at all neighbourhood, local and town centre zones across the whole of Auckland and says which ones we're going to intensify around. And as per the last slide, we're not doing anything in the rural area, anything on the islands. We're doing 11 in the north, 11 in the south, and 22 on the isthmus in terms of intensification. But I would say again, 3D is there is intensification around these centres, but this is small fry compared to what is going on in policy 3C, where we did the 800 metre catchments around all the metropolitan centres, all the train stations and so on. That is a huge amount of capacity and a huge amount of areas going to minimum 6 stories through that. Then we've got the medium density residential standard, which applies to basically the rest of residential Auckland. So while we are talking about upzoning here, it really is not significant, but in comparison to what else is going on, this is not the major bit of intensification that's happening through the NPS.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bartley. I will now take the question of, I think it is Councillor Hills. Councillor Hills, your call.
Kia ora, Chair, thank you, and very good discussion, and thanks to the staff for trying to put together what is an extremely complex set of things for us, as always with this. I guess my questions, and they were sort of in the workshop yesterday about a different issue, but I guess in the scheme of things, are we following the law? Is there anything we are pushing back against the law? So are we in line with the law with these resolutions and the sort of endorsement? Just want to make sure. And the other thing is, and it's not completely connected, but how can we improve other things that are maybe not connected but would improve things. I can just think of an example right now, Chair, in Shakespeare Road near Smales Farm, where a local centre is being made into apartments. That's great. They're putting some restaurants in, but then the other part of the frontage, which is currently shops, is going to be the underground car park or whatever. Are there things that we can improve with these changes, such as ensuring we keep, shop frontage or whatever, that kind of, in those mixed use areas? Can we tag on things like that to these plan changes and processes, or is this got to be just following the law and we can't, make improvements like that?
So in terms of the first question, are we following the law? Yes, definitely. With this policy 3D, where there's no question we're well in accordance with the law. This is not a very directive policy as compared to policy 3C, where it says you have to put a minimum 6 stories around walkable catchment. This one says increase the heights and density commensurate with the level of services and activities. So there's a lot of leeway for us to decide what is a commensurate level of height and density. So I think what we're proposing here is well within that. The second question around issues around putting car parking on frontages and so on, an urban design issue, that maybe John could potentially answer that, because that is slightly outside what we are looking at here, but I know that those issues are coming up all the time around urban design issues in our centres and residential areas.
Yeah, so I can pick that one up. Councillor Hills and committee, I think so, we're looking at making some design improvements to the unitary plan, sort of strengthening some of the design controls. There are limitations now with the Amendment Act, sort of putting constraints on what we can do there, but we're still progressing that work off the back of some of our monitoring of how effective the unitary plan has been. The idea is that it would come together at the same time as this NPSUD intensification plan change, but it would be a separate parallel plan change. So under the law, we can't put those sort of improvements that you're talking about. They're beyond the scope of the intensification plan change, but we are looking to bring to you a parallel plan change with some of those improvements. So we'll pick up on that issue and perhaps contact you offline to get a bit more detail on that one, Councillor Hills.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just being cheeky to see what else we could try and get in there and not waste but not use so much staff time and resource if we could tag things on. Thank you, Chair, and thanks for that first answer too, Ryan. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hills. Now I'll go back to Councillor Walker, please. Councillor Walker, did you have a further question? Councillor Walker, you wanted to ask further questions, I think. Nope. Okay, not with us. Members, are there any other questions on this paper before us, before we go to comments? None? Okay, it's moved by myself, seconded by Councillor Dalton. So members, we have workshopped this. We've had some very good discussions with the local board chairs and appointees on this. It's the next part of our direction making in response to the NPSUD and the legislation which amended the NPSUD. We're looking at just policy 3D here. We are, as reminded by our staff, we are acting in accordance with the law. We are following the direction given to us by the Parliament. We are doing it with the very best work possible that's been undertaken in recent months, and that sits solidly behind this work. And while it could have been a little bit different if we had more time, we don't have that time, and we're hearing from our staff that it is very unlikely that it would show up to be much different. So I remind members that we are acting in response to the edict of the Parliament, and that was National Labour co-sponsored legislation. So the big changes, let's remember, are not in the 3D part that we're talking about today. The big changes are actually in the 3A and the 3B around the RTN, major centres, walkable catchments, and then the medium density residential standards as they apply over Auckland. That's where the big changes are. So today's directions, they apply to B, 3 and 4. Those centres identified on pages 83, 84 of our agenda. Today's changes can't be seen in isolation of our next directions, which will be on special qualifying matters already determined and special qualifying matters to be determined. And we'll be looking at that on the 31st of March. So you can't look at a zone plan provision in isolation of overlays. And for example, if I take a centre that's familiar to me, Devonport, you can't see today's decision in isolation of volcanic view shaft overlay or a height sensitive area overlay or our decisions on the extent of special character in that area around Devonport. There's just an example. Now you could apply that to many parts of Auckland. So this decision does not suggest that the zoning provision stands alone. Now I hope the officers have explained a lot of the detail to us today to an extent by which to which we can lend support to these motions on this date and help us as we progress towards the 31st of March. I'll leave it there and take other comments. Do I have others to comment, please? I don't think so. Cassandra, am I missing somebody? I do now. Councillor Watson, please. Councillor Watson.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. And I agree with your comments that the endorsement today can't be seen in isolation. Can't be seen in isolation of the overlays that you mentioned and the other qualifying matters, but can't be seen in isolation of what's coming up as part of this package too. So as much as we're considering 3D today, it's part of a far bigger suite of very significant changes that are coming up that we got a slight taster for yesterday, and which are very, very concerning on a number of fronts. So what that means, Mr. Chair, is that people like myself get a really an invidious position of having, and you know, without relitigating the submissions that were made to the select committee, which just wasn't the mayor and yourself. There was a submission from a group of 5 councillors that I was involved with, who probably had a similar experience to you, where we submitted to the select committee with, you know, in very strong opposition, concentrating mainly on the medium density provisions. But what struck me about that day was actually listening to the raft of other submitters, far more qualified than me and far more persuasive, from, you know, district law societies, to institutes of architects, to urban design experts, to market economists, heritage consultants, etc., all saying essentially the same thing, and we're pointing to the, you know, to the very real shortcomings that exist with this, you know, this proposal, which have all been largely ignored. So when we get to the first stage in this, as we are today, then you know, it's a little bit like collaboration by section, and in so doing, it really ends up with people who have real concerns being left in a very invidious position of apparently having to support the intent and the policies that are consequential to this housing enabling bill. Now, you have mentioned and others have mentioned, you know, our requirement. You required, and you know, no one's disputing that. But I guess my concern is that, you know, we get torn between, on the face of it, a legal requirement, on the other hand, representing what we might reasonably expect the view our communities might have on this. And I mean, it's coincidental that just today there's big full-page ads in the suburban papers about this very process, which, you know, 3D is part of, entitled "Making Room to Grow." Lovely big coloured graphic there with a scattering of what looks like medium density standard houses, 3-storey houses, a little more green space than will be the reality, I might add. But if you were to read this as a member of the public, notwithstanding a couple of passing references to our need to respond to the government's policy statement, you would get the impression that is actually Auckland Council who are involved in initiating this. In April, Auckland Council will be asking Aucklanders for feedback on some changes to the Auckland Unitary Plan, our city's planning rulebook, to allow for more housing at grade heights and density. And it goes on to really make the case for these changes. So that's not what I want to do, Mr. Chair. Yesterday we heard that these experts that I listened to and who are most impressive in the select committee here, they've been ignored as much as us, and we were told that this was a political decision. You know, this was a political decision that was driving it, a cross-party political decision, not that that makes it any better. So I guess I can go on being told that, you know, this is the law, we just have to do it. And it starts here today with, you know, policy 3D of the National Policy Statement. But what's not coming with that is our political response. So what I'm being told, and other members have been told, is that, well, no, just go ahead and do this, support this, because you don't have a choice. But there's no consequential political response from Auckland Council other than this full-page ad, which, you know, any casual reading of it suggests that, you know, Auckland Council is initiating this, might be responding, but is actually a driving force behind that. So I'm not comfortable with that. I'm not comfortable with voting on this today, especially in some of the sensitive areas of my ward where I don't know the specific streets that it applies to, and I've been caught out with that before. Small change or not, I want to know exactly what I'm dealing with. I don't have that information today. That's nothing to do with the officers. They're going flat stack because of this crazy timeline, which again we're just accepting. And certainly it was instructive for me, for one of the market economists who during that select process referred to that very issue of this kind of lack of poor research, overcooked urgency.
Sorry, that's 5 minutes, Councillor.
And the taking away of the democratic rights. So in summing up, I won't be supporting it.
Extension of time.
I'm going to make a stand today. I'm signalling my interest in a more political response from Auckland Council leading up to March, and I would urge anyone that's got similar reservations to do likewise. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. Members, I'm just looking at the motions. Now, this is a little bit irregular because we've started the speaking turns, but I'm just wondering, would it be helpful if we made it clear, and if we could, I'm not sure whether this is possible, but I'm just wondering whether we make it clear that what we're moving on today, that is particularly the B, and particularly B3 and 4, are the directions and the purpose of which is for preparing our draft response. And that will be subject to engagement. Would it be helpful if we drafted an add-on motion to make that clear, members? Can I just hear some voices? Because this is part of a process. This is not determining the end. This is part of the process. So again, would would it be helpful if we added on a motion that made it clear that these so-called principles under B are for the purpose of preparing our draft response for public engagement? I have silence at the moment. Are there any views on that? Can I go to you, John? John, would it be helpful can I just check with staff on this then? Would it be helpful if that motion was amended to what we've got before us?
Yeah, I've got no problem with that amendment that you're proposing. Not sure what the wording would be exactly, but I don't see any issue with it.
John?
Chair, also comfortable with that wording.
Okay,
to accept that as seconder, Chair.
Okay, now I just want to check with others. Is there any objection to that being added at this time? Can I just text you quickly? Or John, I'll handle the further speaking turns. And John, could you communicate with Sandra O'Toole, please? And just so that we can see it for the benefit of members on the screen.
So just point of order, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Watson.
I don't mean to interrupt you here. So you've had an introductory speaking slot. Are you moving this by way of amendment? If so, it will have to be someone else that moves it and seconds it because you've already had a speaking slot.
So as chair, I asked if there was a willingness to accept this and there was silence. I didn't hear from anybody. I waited and then I went to the staff. So yeah. I'm trying to be inclusive here rather than be dictating things, Councillor Watson. I'm reading your speech and I'm trying to reflect on that to grab the general feel. Okay, so look,
I'm not disputing that. I'm just saying it still is a correct procedure to be followed.
There is absolutely so at all times. Thank you. So while John is looking at that, there are the words now. Can members just reflect on that? Can I ask, is there any dissenting voice to having those words included?
Chair, it's
Councillor Hills.
Yeah, just checking, is that in line with the law and the policy? Like that is what is
John,
happening, and that is
go
what
to you, John.
That is what we can do and have to do, or are we just getting public engagement on something?
Okay, I'll go to John. In line with the law.
There is no requirement to engage with the public at all until the plan changes for formal submissions in August. So this is a choice that the committee made last year to put whatever draft proposals we have out for feedback in April. So it's our choice and entirely within the law to have a set of principles agreed at this point that help inform that engagement process. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you, John. Thank you, Councillor Dalton. And note the comment of Councillor Henderson. I'll resume the speaking list then, and I believe the next speaker is Councillor Walker.
Sure. So I'll be very clear. I'll be voting against this, and more than likely, I'll be voting against the entire package when it comes up. And the reason for that is very clear. It is totally unnecessary, because we do not need the additional housing supply in Auckland. The Unitary Plan already provides for that and was produced at immense cost. I believe that if Aucklanders as a whole and as individuals in communities and neighbourhoods were aware of these proposals to the extent that they need to be, they would be absolutely opposed. And as Councillor Watson points out, this is being driven politically. I do not believe that Auckland Council should be complicit in this process, and we should be voting against it. The scale of what is proposed for Aucklanders is massive. The consequence of what will happen is that all of the properties in the areas that are being massively upzoned won't be able to be purchased by people for homes. They will only be able to be purchased by developers and speculators because the values of the properties will be determined by their future potential. And their future potential is a quantum shift from what they are being used for now. So this will not produce more homes for Aucklanders in the near future. It will not produce affordability. It will rip out the heart of Auckland as it goes to its heritage, as it goes to its livability. It's totally unsatisfactory. It is of immense concern to me that this council has not informed Aucklanders to the degree that they need to be informed about the consequences of what the government is foisting on us. And we should be mounting a concerted campaign so that Aucklanders are aware of what this brings to them in their communities. Certainly it does that on the shore in places like Birkenhead and Northcote and Devonport, but equally on the Isthmus, in Epsom, where I grew up, in Remuera, out west as well, everywhere where there is a building of substance that has character, in large part, that will be gone, that home will be gone. So we need to oppose this, Mr. Chair, and I will be taking a principled stand and voting against this. And I believe that the onus is on government and our council to inform Aucklanders of what the consequences are. And that has not happened. In large part, this is proceeding in stealth, and I'm opposed to that. Thank you.
So look, I do need to come in at this point, Councillor Walker and all members. The suggestion is that Auckland Council is complicit with government. Now, I take exception to that. Complicit suggests we are acting unlawfully. That's what complicit means, Councillor. We are not acting unlawfully. This council is not acting unlawfully in its response
Point of
to
order,
NPSG.
Mr. Chair?
No, I'm speaking. No.
Point of order.
No, it's not a point of order.
How do you know it's not a point of order?
I'm calling you to order now, please.
Point of order.
I'm calling you to order. You're interrupting me as I'm making a chair's explanation. Members, Auckland Council is not acting unlawfully. On no account are our staff or any elected member, be the mayor and myself, as those who made our submissions to the Select Committee or in our discussions with government at any time, past or of recent, we have not acted unlawfully. And it is wrong for Councillor Walker to suggest that this council is complicit. That is a wrong use of the word, Councillor. Now, what is your point of order, Councillor?
My point of order, Mr. Chair, is that at no point did I use the expression unlawful or refer to it in any way. So I have a real concern at the words that you use that endeavour to express what I say when my words stand for themselves. I repeat, I did not
I think you need to choose.
Unlawful.
Look, you used the word
very
complicit,
careful,
so
Mr.
I think
Chair.
you need to look at the definition of complicit. Thank you. I'll go to the next speaker, please. Sandra, who is the next speaker, please? Sandra, could you assist, please?
Sure. Just one moment. I've just lost my thing. Councillor Henderson.
Councillor Henderson, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, colleagues. You know, I've heard in this debate that we're saying that we don't need any additional housing supply, that the unitary plan's done a fantastic job for the city and there's no more issues. Never mind, move along. And yet we have a runaway housing crisis with shocking levels of homelessness and insecure housing in Auckland. We have heard that evidence in workshops ourselves last year, live. We have heard everything discussed here, but the need for Aucklanders to live in warm and dry homes. I would encourage again my colleagues to read the independent reports produced around these changes, which are independent, like I've said. It states clearly that this will provide more affordable homes for people, but this isn't the only reason for the change. There's another reason. It also allows different housing types available for young people and families in some of the best connected communities in Auckland, in places where people need it, close to their work, their study and their public transport. We've had communities in West and South Auckland which have already been transformed due to the housing crisis. They are struggling in some places for infrastructure to support it. And yet in the places with 15 rapid transit bus routes and places with new water pipes going in, etc., we can't put housing there. That's outrageous to me. I think we should pick housing first. We should allow people to live in warm and dry homes in the city. And so I'm proud to support this. I voted against this last time because it didn't go far enough. And it turns out I was right. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Henderson. I'll now go to the Deputy Mayor, please.
No comment, Mr. Chair. I'm agreeing with Councillor Henderson.
Okay, thank you, Deputy Mayor.
Councillor Sayers.
Councillor Sayers, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I hope that's coming through okay on this internet connection. Can you hear me?
We hear you. It's good.
Oh, great. Thank you, Chris. Look, I think my comments would be that we find the council and the councillors being put in a less than satisfactory position whereby we're having to vote on something very significant around housing and the housing impact for Auckland. And it's due, as we've discussed, to a political decision from the central government, and Auckland Council is being forced to make supporting decisions and within what I would say is an unreasonable timeline. And because of that, councils have a lack of understanding of the exact impact, particularly within the wards plus wider Auckland, a lack of maps to assist our understanding in those areas, and having to make decisions in a partial and segmented fashion and process. And many of my constituents don't feel comfortable with that, and specifically with the compacted timelines and the process not being as fully as formed as it could be if we had more time, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Sayers. The next speaker is Councillor Stewart.
Councillor Cooper.
Sorry, Councillor Cooper. Councillor Cooper. Councillor Cooper, your call.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess for me, look, there's going to be a lot of people that'll think this is great, a lot of people that'll think this is bad. But where we are in this process now is that we need to adopt this so our staff can get on with more work and it can actually develop a draft to go out for public engagement. So to me, this is very open. This is a public meeting now. It's being live streamed, people can access it. And I also note that we made a very strong submission to government and we weren't heard. We weren't listened to. So as much as I don't like the fact that our hand is being forced, my concern is that, as with the previous government, being threatened that if we don't go ahead with this, a minister will step in and make the decision for us. For me, at least we have some control. We get to have a chance to look at qualifying matters that are really important to Auckland. If we don't do this, then we could just be carte blanche, and I'm not prepared for that to happen. So for me, that's why I will vote for it. It doesn't mean I agree with it all, but it does mean that it opens up the way to have something good that can go out to the public and we can hear from them. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Cooper. Now, I think the next speaker is Councillor Dalton. Councillor Dalton, your call.
It was Stuart.
I've got a call for a division from Councillor Stewart. Look, I'll go to Councillor Stewart, please, if you don't mind, Councillor Dalton. Councillor Stewart, please.
Thank you. I just want to congratulate Councillor Walker's comment for having the courage to say push back on the government, and I won't be supporting this today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Dalton.
Thank you, Chair. And I will be supporting it. Obviously, I seconded it. And I would also like to support Councillor Stewart's call for a division. I think that's an excellent idea. Love the energy of the younger generation. Thank you, Councillor Henderson, seeing the vision for the future of Auckland. And if we could all just be focused on that, it gets very political and unnecessarily so, in my view. It reminds me, I listen to some of the debates sometimes, and it reminds me of when I was a teenager driving with my cousin in her Austin A30, probably built in the 1950s, and you had to pull the choke out to start it. And you had to leave the choke out as you tried to gain momentum. And if you pushed the choke back in too soon, it would just stall and you'd get nowhere. That's what some of these debates remind me of from some of my colleagues. We must have this vision for Auckland. This is not ideal when something is forced on us, but we make the best we can. And what an incredible job Ryan and John and the team are doing. And so when the time comes where we can look at qualifying matters, which is absolutely important to this piece of work, we need to make sure that we have a robust discussion and debate about that too, because this city has an incredible future for it if we allow it to happen. And if we do enable it, and there will be people that won't like intensification in their areas, it's going gangbusters out in the suburbs and the outer suburbs, I can tell you. But we need to get people closer to transport. We need to get these emissions reduced. We need to do all the things we're saying in other debates, and then we get to things like this where it gets a bit political and people aren't happy, and we change our tune. We can't have it both ways. But holding the vision for Auckland around whatever that might be, 15-minute communities, 15-minute neighbourhoods, and what we need to get there to get people living close to public transport is what we've got to keep top of mind, regardless of how we get there, whether we're pushed in this instance, as we may well be, or not. So I'll be supporting this, and I'm looking forward to the other matters that come back, because I think they're the ones that are really interesting, and it will shape our city, that we can continue to hold on to some of our heritage. I mean, we're a young city, but I've been to, I think of San Francisco and the districts in San Francisco that have their own uniqueness, that have kept some of their heritage buildings, that are modern, that have a business district. We can be that. And it's a vision we should be holding fast to, and not thinking that we might look like the city of Split, which is not the most attractive city in itself. So thank you for the opportunity to speak to this, and thank you to the councillors who will continue to support this vision for Auckland. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll now go to Councillor Daniel Newman.
Well, thank you, Chair. And I think a vision for this debate would be assisted if members can contribute to it. And I acknowledge, Chair, that this is difficult. But just before we address the substance of the resolution, I do think that if a point of order is called, it should be heard, not presumed. But I'll leave that for your consideration, Chair. With respect to the resolutions, I do support a public engagement on it. I want to acknowledge Ryan. I've known Ryan for a long time. He is a good planner. Frankly, some of the direction set down in the proposed NPSUD applied is, in my view, rubbish, because part of the change, in my view, is about transferring from the discretionary professional approach that the planners seek to inform decisions for the planning direction of Auckland, to a very permissive approach that will suit land bankers and developers. And that's a concern for me, because we've already seen some of the transformation, and some of that transformation in the suburbs is appalling.
and it's appalling now, and it will certainly be very bad in the future as this is super scaled up. Some of these communities are not resilient and they will struggle. The infrastructure is not in place. The urban design is poor in my view. There are all sorts of issues that will create a challenge for the well-being of those communities in the future. However, Chair, it is absolutely the case, as Councillor Henderson has pointed out, that there are places around the region. Well, the point of order wasn't identified because the person raising the point of order wasn't able to address it. But there are issues in relation to some parts of the region where there does need to be significant upsizing of town centres and locations, and I've already expressed my views in relation to the way in which heritage overlays seem to protect certain parts of the region where wealth is incredibly concentrated and there is great market potential for redevelopment, Chair. If there's anything I think that could be added to the resolutions, it would be a clarifier that the principles seek to give effect to what Parliament has required of local government, noting that local government is a creature of statute, and not that this is seeking to be any form of excuse, but it is quite nice to think that sometimes we can get Parliament's decisions and the consequences of Parliament's decisions better clarified for our constituents, so that those people in Parliament who are passing this legislation are more accountable for it. So, Chair, it's up to you if you want to consider this using your discretion to add a clarifier that these principles would seek to give effect to what Parliament has required of us, both through the NPSUD and obviously through subsequent legislation. Thank you, Chair. I will be supporting the resolutions regardless.
Thanks, Councillor Newman. Look, you've asked for a slight change, I gather, to the B there. Is that what you're referring to, Councillor Newman? Just want to clarify.
Well, I mean, it's not going to influence my intention to vote for it. I'm happy to vote for it. I think if there are people around this table who are concerned that they feel that the inference here in B is that this is Auckland Council's design, well, Auckland Council is trying to give effect to what we're required to give effect to. And if you wanted to add words to that effect in the form of giving effect to what is required of Auckland Council by virtue of the NPSUD and what Parliament codifies, then I would be happy for that addition if you think it's necessary.
Okay, look, I'm amenable to the suggestion, but I need to check with the Deputy Chair, and then I would, if that was okay, can I just check with the Deputy, the seconder, please, the seconder, Councillor Dalton.
Look, that's going to help. That's fine.
Councillor.
Well, I'll use the comment bar to propose some few additional words if you want, Chair.
Okay. Could you go to John Dogood? Could you text John Dogood, please, Councillor Newman?
Well, if John Dogood could send me his number, I'm happy to.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, if you have a look, it's actually been amended now. If members want to have a look at the screen.
I'm agreeable to that. And
it looks good.
Yeah, look, that's fine with me.
Okay, I don't think this is a substantive change. I think we can accept that. Are there any dissenting voices to the proposal of Councillor Newman? I'm going to take that silence as okaying that, and I will now go to the next speaker. And I will just check.
Councillor Bartley, please.
Councillor Bartley.
Chair, I still had a question of clarification just in the sidebar that was after Councillor Newman.
Okay, I'll go to Councillor Bartley first, and then I will I'll just catch up with that question, please. Councillor Bartley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for this item. I'm noting what officers said about 3D being small fry, and yet it's not a small fry response that's coming from us. In the beginning, I was not supporting it because I thought that it was quite restrictive in the intentions of the NPSUD and intensification. But now, after hearing from Councillor Walker, I want to support this. I am picking up on, the principles, and I see the principles being around that these principles are quite technical, but for me, I see the principles being that everyone deserves a home and shelter. And whatever we can do to enable that will be awesome, given our Auckland plan talking about participation and inclusion. Everyone has the right to live in Auckland in a home. And we have so many that don't live in a home. And I know people are speaking for their constituents. I want to speak for constituents that have no voice, that are not in a residents association, that are working 4 jobs just to pay the rent because rent is so unaffordable. People that will never be able to afford a home, like myself, because there actually are not enough houses out there. So I absolutely disagree with the statements made that we do not need additional supply of housing, because we do. Even in my walk this morning with my dog Milo, in the park, came across a lady sleeping in her 4-wheel drive with her dog, and that really got to me because I'm there walking with my dog, and this woman has to sleep in her car with her dog. And I can see how that happens because it's so hard to find accommodation, let alone if you have a pet. So enable more housing needs to happen. We need more housing. I hear what people are saying about, well, you're just making more money for developers. Those houses are not going to be affordable, but you need more houses, and we need the programs to go around building more houses to make them more affordable and accessible for everyone to try and buy, as well as rent. I am happy with the potential that the report incorporating potential about commercial activity, because I believe the more people that move into like an area with a neighborhood shops, they will help, they'll have a positive impact on the commercial activity there. So that's good. I look at my own community. We already have 3 stories up, massive developments in our neighborhood centres. And, if it's in certain areas, why can't it be in other areas? I'm very concerned about some of the comments coming from other councillors around mounting a concerted effort, pushback on the government, considering what we've just gone through down in Parliament and in the Domain. So I'd be careful around those words. But yeah, thank you to the officers for their work and all of this, because it's very confusing, but you guys help make it clearer to understand what it means in the big picture for Auckland. So appreciating Councillor Dalton's comments as well, and Councillor Henderson. So yeah, keeping to our vision. Thank you. Inclusive Auckland, that's what I'm keeping to.
Thank you, Councillor Bartley. I will just go to the ask for Councillor Hills. You had a question, and it was around clarification of a matter.
Yeah, kia ora, Chair, and there has been other questions and changes, so I hope this is not out of order. But I guess for me, on situations like this, I just want to ensure or ask a question: what would happen if this got voted down? I don't have a clear indication of what would happen if we just opposed this. I know this is during a debate, but I do have a concern that it's not clear what would happen if this was voted down.
Okay, I'll have to go. I know we're in the middle of debate here. It's a point of clarification. Now, Sandra, can I just go to you on the standing orders? Can you just tell me and tell others what the standing orders say about asking a question when we're actually in debate? Now, look, through this meeting, we have not necessarily followed the standing orders at all times anyway, but do the standing orders permit the asking of a question when we're in debate?
Unfortunately not. Once debate has commenced, no questions should be asked after that.
Councillor Hills, I'm going to have to let you maybe address that You haven't taken a speaking turn, but you might like to, as yet have you, you might like to maybe address that in your speaking turn. Okay.
Cool,
so I'll have
you.
to.
I thought I
I'm
would just
sorry.
be cheeky like everyone else, getting staff to
I
answer
know.
questions.
I know. Thank you. Councillor Collins, please.
Oh, thank you, Chair. Kia ora, Chair. I've got similar comments to Councillor Bartley, because originally it was the question around the principles that I was a little bit, I was wanting to seek some clarification. So thank you to Councillor Bartley for asking them, because I did feel it just made me feel like the paper, or at least the principle, was restrictive. But I accept, having listened in with the yesterday's workshop and to the discussion today, that the analysis that the officers have undertaken give me a sense of comfort that it will allow for the intensification that I think our city needs. I got quite excited when I was listening to Councillor Dalton. I remember those cars, Councillor Dalton, because we used to have one growing up, and our dad was a taxi driver, you'll remember, and so pulling that choke, I always used to wonder what the purpose of that little gadget was. And so thanks for explaining it, because I was little and enjoying the car. But it has felt like this, the discussion. And look, Chair, I accept that there are people who are wanting to speak strongly to advocate for their communities and positions people have held and desires that they have. But my desire is to see intensification. And I look at what's happening in Māngere and Otara at the moment, the area that I represent, and I would agree with Councillor Newman that some of the development that's going on at the moment is just terrible. But on the other hand, we're thinking, well, how do we get some of our homeless people, some of our families who've just been renting for so long, they're paying more now in rent than they would if they could afford to get a mortgage. How do we find solutions for them? And that's often what's on my mind. And I'm excited about the idea of a 15-minute city. So thanks for that reminder, Councillor Dalton. The way we can walk more, we can turn to active modes of transport, which is getting ourselves out of the apartment we might be in and being able to walk no more than 8 to 10 minutes. And there we've got some fantastic amenity and services. So, Chair, I will be supporting the motion today, and I want to thank the officers, because I really do pick up the challenges that they've been under, because this is turning around work very quickly, but this is an opportunity for us to get it out for public consultation, but also to continue our desire to see intensification, to see our climate emissions addressed, get people out of cars. So yeah, I just wanted to say it's been a great discussion. I want to offer a special thanks to the officers, because as I tuned into the workshop, particularly yesterday, I thought, man, there's a whole lot of work and thinking that's gone on, and I've really appreciated it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Collins, and I will now go to Member Tau Henare, please. Kia ora tau.
Kia ora, Mr. Chair. I'll just put my little camera on. Oh, there I am. Now, okay, look, I think that it's all well and good that we're thinking of all the homeless and people that can't afford a home. But just to give you a shining example of what's going on out here in my neck of the woods, and for Māori as well. One of the things opposite me, there are 3 houses that have been removed just across the road, 500, even not less than 500 meters away. 16 apartments are being built, 2-storied, hopefully, maybe 3, I don't know. Around the corner, less than 800 meters away, there are now 32 apartments that have been built opposite each other. Around the other corner, there are another 16 apartments going up. Each of these apartments, and down the right of way, 2 houses away, there's 6 apartments just being finished. So that's about 50 to 60 apartments within a stone's throw of my backyard. Now, I don't mind that, because I actually think apartments are the way to go in the future. I think that intensification has to happen. No longer can we look for the old quarter acre section. I'm one of the lucky ones. But then I think of all of those people that, one, can't afford it, a home, two, don't even have a home at all right at this moment, and how the hell are they going to be able to afford what is going up in my little wee neighbourhood? I asked one of the developers how much for one of the apartments across the road from me, and he said, and a 2-bedroom apartment, not a 3-bedroom, no piece of grass to throw a ball around on or make a little garden, 900K. And I'm just thinking that's as a bare minimum. I'm thinking, well, none of my whānau are going to be able to afford that. And Mr. Chair, I've got a 1960s weatherboard house, 3, maybe 4, maybe 5 bedroom. You know, in my front yard, I have 2 cabins, rented 2 cabins to increase I have 10 people in my home at the moment, and I can't see that dropping anytime soon. It's the way it is at the moment. Regardless of whether I vote for or against this stuff is happening. What worries me is the fact that suburbs like, how should I say it? Not all the white neighbourhoods, but all the really quite wealthy neighbourhoods, they ain't getting what we're getting. They ain't getting what Otara, where I grew up. I spent my first 23 years in Otara. You know, Mangere are getting the infill, the high intensification, and some of them are shitty, honestly. I mean, I'm not a designer and I'm not a planner, but boy, I know what looks good and I know what doesn't look good. And I know what looks cheap and nasty, and I know what looks really well. And it just seems to me that no one with their hands on the levers is putting in place some safeguards about what does go up, where it goes up, and we haven't even mentioned affordability. We've mentioned buildings, we've mentioned structures, we've mentioned shopping centres and blah blah blah, but no one's actually mentioned affordability. And I know that sometimes is very difficult for councils to get a hold of, because we think that it should lay at the feet of central government. But I think it's all of our responsibility. In particular, my responsibility is for Mātāwaka, Māori in our urban areas. And I'm afraid we ain't even on the ladder. And it's most probably no doubt why we fill up all of the hotels and motels that are being offered as emergency housing at the moment. Whether I do or not, I mean, it's neither here nor there. The government is doing what they think that their responsibility is, and that's cool. So I don't think voting for it or voting against it is going to be. It's not going to hinder us in any way. They're going to do what they have to do. So yeah, I'm a bit ambivalent of yes, no, or maybe. And Councillor Dalton, yes, I do know what a choke is. It's just a great advice to get things going. Before you put your foot on the accelerator. I think Auckland, I think New Zealand is at the crossroads of how our cities and our suburbs look like long after I've gone, and I'm looking either up or down on the developments of Tamaki. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Member Henry. I'll now take the call of Councillor Coombe.
Kia ora, Mr. Chair. In terms of speaking to this, I'd like to really double the clutch, which is what I have to do on my 1934 Austin 7. Might need to get it out of the garage. And really just focus on what we're actually being asked to do today. Policy 3D was amended under the Enabling Act. Council put in a very robust submission into that Act and made our views very clear on that. We've now got a clear requirement of what we have to do. And when I hear about that we need to take a principled approach by voting this down, I really have to ask, well, what is the alternative? And it would be a principled approach if those councillors who wish to oppose it today tell us what the alternative is and how they would interpret the new wording of Policy 3D differently. They haven't put anything on the table. They haven't shared with us any views on the interpretation or how they would amend the zoning in the centres, which is what we're meant to be looking at today. And you know, the courage that I would like to see from those councillors who are going to vote it down, I would like to see them come along to my residents association in Herne Bay, in Freeman's Bay, St Mary's Bay, city centre residents, and come along and explain why we haven't been able to go out to do the public engagement in April because they ground the officers' work to a halt. And I do, you know, acknowledge the huge amount of work that officers are doing under the pump to try and get this the proposal ready to be able to notify the plan change in August. It is a really, really tight time frame, and we're very fortunate that we're going to have this stage of early engagement. Now, this early engagement is not going to happen if councillors choose to make a symbolic political statement by voting this down, because we won't then be able to actually take it out for that early engagement. So please, Councillor Stewart, come to my ward and show your courage and explain why you think there's an different alternative and why you didn't want residents, Aucklanders, to be able to have that early engagement. And I will offer my own view of what will happen if we block every step of the way this direction and what we're required to do. Commissioners will be called in, and or government will just decide it at the end of the day. And I can guarantee if this ends up being left to the minister, we're going to have far more intensification and far more upzoning, and a lot of people far happier across those wards where these councillors want to grind this process to a halt. So I just find that they haven't addressed the counterfactual, haven't put anything on the table, and that is really unprincipled. So I would, you know, I wasn't really feeling the need to speak to this because I think it's quite straightforward. And as Ryan mentioned to us, you know, the work that we're going to have to do outside of this is going to be a lot more intense and a lot more difficult. Just another point that I just also wanted to make is that in terms of the work that's being brought to us today and the decision making, it is there's going to be a lot of people who will say that we should actually go further in intensifying our town centres and our local centres, and those will say it's gone too far. Well, this is what we want to have this early engagement about. I would like to hear from that broad range of views that we're going to hear. So I'm sorry, but it just does not make any sense to oppose this just on the basis of trying to send the government a message that we didn't support the original Enabling Act. It's just nonsensical, and as my colleagues will know, I just cannot. I find it very difficult to I really am not a fan of those who do not make principled decision making based on the evidence and based on what's in front of them. And so it was very disappointing to hear some of those comments and to be told that it would to call on us to have courage to vote it down when it's quite the opposite. And so I was pleased. Thank you, Councillor Dalton, for your very positive comments. It was really good to hear that and think of a way of bringing to this debate a positive kind of note to end on, because I didn't want just to be. I do just want to express why I'm supporting this in a positive way, which is because I think this is what we do need to engage with Aucklanders to be able to go out on to pass to. Sorry. It's very important that we do this.
Councillor Coombe.
Thank you. I will just wrap up to say I am voting in support of this because I think it's really important that we do have that ability to take this forward with the early engagement with Aucklanders. Kia ora. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, colleagues.
Kia ora. Thank you, Councillor. I'll now take the call of Councillor Young, please. Councillor Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's from the cross-party decision for the whole country, and as the councillor, we need to make a decision for our Auckland whole region. My previous Asian experience, actually, there were much high levels development, and that's the reason we coming migrant to here. But back to 20, 30 years ago, I probably would not support this one because but the reality is our population for Auckland that's increasing and house demanding. And so we have to do something now and also for our new generation. So every decision, everything must have two sides. I'm glad to hear all the councillor points, but I would like to support this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Young, and I will now take the call of Councillor Hills, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I don't have a bunch to say. I do have a lot of opposition to being called complicit and the government being called complicit, or the council being called complicit, or our staff being called complicit, because it does relate to breaking the law with other people, and that is not what we're doing. We're actually trying to prevent ourselves breaking the law, and voting against this and stopping the process and voting against it and sending a message would be being complicit, because we would be breaking the law. And I have had messages from staff about my question earlier that if we did vote against all this and stop the process, and the numbers were in favour of dropping this, then the government would take over, as Councillor Coombe said. We would not have a choice in what is going ahead here, and then we would be derelict in our duty for Aucklanders to actually make decisions and be responsible and not turn everything into politics. I've seen a lot of things recently that disappoint me, such as the Hauraki Goff emails and the confusion and people thinking that certain things are happening which are not. This, unfortunately, and I can see it coming through probably the election period, is that people are going to believe that that we are complicit and that all these terrible things are going to happen, and we're forcing people out of their homes and off their gardens and all sorts of things, much like happened many years ago with the unitary plan. I don't agree with everything in this bill, and I would hate to think that any of us agreed with everything a government bill did. But what they're trying to do is address the issues that people keep telling us about, whether that's climate change, whether that's public transport, congestion, access, whether it's the fact that we have people living in motels all over our community because there is not enough housing. And yes, that a lot of the private development that's being built is expensive, but this does enable kāinga ora to increase their density as well, which we see is getting people into warm, dry housing across our communities right now. So it is complicated. It is always going to be disruptive. But I think sometimes we can push people into fear. I see people that the population, people saying things like our population is exploding, and we can't have these people coming here and affecting our infrastructure when all the evidence says infrastructure is being built to deal with those issues, and that we have to provide access. I mean, I grew up on in a house with no garden, no outdoor area, no lawn. We were infill housing in Glenfield and grew up, and we were able to walk up to the amazing parks and schools that we have. But that was in the 90s that our house was built, and it wasn't something that's brand new under the unitary plan. It was because it was affordable for my parents to build and stay in Glenfield, and they want to do that as they get older too. And I hope my sisters can do the same as well. And I think you can hear maybe Theo screaming in the background, so he's obviously speaking up for the younger generation as well. Yeah, I do get worried when we tie ourselves in knots on things that can't happen and don't happen. And if we all voted against this, then we're in a much, much stickier situation than if the majority of us vote this forward. And I just want to thank the staff again for spending all Christmas and lockdown and dealing with these issues as they have. So kia ora, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hills, and I'll now go to Mayor Phil Goff, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll be brief because it's been a long debate. When you and I appeared before the Select Committee on the Resource Management Enabling Housing Supply Bill, we made some pretty strident's the wrong word, we made some strong criticisms of aspects of the legislation that Parliament, bipartisan by the way, between National and Labor, put in that bill. And I don't resile from any of the criticisms we made. However, that was not a reflection of our opposition to intensification. We believe in intensification. We've written it into all of our policies, including our Auckland plan, that we want a quality compact city in Auckland. The aspects that would detract from quality were the aspects that we opposed. But what we're looking at here are things that actually we didn't strongly oppose. What our officers have done, and I want to acknowledge John Dogood and his team for doing it, they've gone out, they've taken the requirements placed on us by Parliament, and they've made sensible decisions about where intensification is appropriate and where it's not. It's appropriate where you've got higher density or larger centres and which are highly accessible. There is nothing in these recommendations that I am fundamentally opposed to. If you want to keep criticising Parliament for what it's doing, for God's sake, focus on the things that we actually object to, rather than the ones that actually we're more relaxed about. Keep your powder dry for where it counts. But by the way, if Parliament makes a decision and passes a law, we're obliged to follow that law. It's called the rule of law. We're not above it. We have to follow it. And we have to try to make the best deal we can out of it while reserving the right to criticise it where we don't think it's appropriate. So I support these recommendations. I think to oppose these recommendations is a bit of grandstanding and pretty futile, because what then? What do we do then? And the answer is, well, we just look silly because we've fired all our shots at something that a lot of people will agree with, rather than reserving our more stringent criticism of the things we don't agree on. So I'm glad we're having a division, and I would urge members to think carefully about how they'd vote on it and make sure that we pass these recommendations. And I enjoyed Angela's comments, but I can't remember what a choke was. I don't think I'm old enough, Angela. Thanks. Cheers.
Thanks, Mayor Phil, and members. I won't take the right of reply on this. I think we've all contributed from our various viewpoints, and we will leave the debate there, though maybe we could put the choke back in now. And we'll go to the vote, and I will pass to Sandra for a vote with division.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Darby.
4.
Councillor Bartley.
4.
Deputy Mayor Cashmore.
Aye.
Councillor Collins.
4.
Councillor Coombe.
Aye.
Councillor Cooper.
4.
Councillor Dalton.
4.
Councillor Fletcher.
Abstain.
Mayor Goff.
In favour.
MSB member Henare.
Aye.
Councillor Henderson.
4.
Councillor Hills.
4. Thank you.
Councillor Mulholland.
Abstain.
Councillor Newman.
Yes.
Councillor Sayers.
Abstain.
Councillor Stewart.
Abstain.
Councillor Walker.
Abstain, and could you put the abstentions in the right column? Thank you.
Councillor Watson.
Abstain.
Councillor Young.
4.
Thank you. So that would be carried.
Thank you.
Votes to no, and we have 6 abstentions.
Thank you. The motion is carried 13 votes to 0. And look, you probably need to note those abstentions on the number. I'm sure you will do that, Sandra, as is per normal. Thank you, members. We will now, I'd like to, before we depart that item completely, John, Ryan and your teams, enormous work going on here. We know you're working long and hard and will continue to do so for some months, actually. So thank you. Please convey that on our behalf to your very stretched teams. Thank you.